But there's also what I call missional integrity. I actually somewhat use the term integrity here in terms of the structural integrity of, say, a ship or an airplane under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
As the negative world bears down on us, we have to avoid deforming under the pressure and be able to stay on mission.
For this hour, we wanted to spend some time talking with Aaron Renn. Now, if you read First Things, that name might be some familiar. He wrote a piece called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. It is now expanded into this book published by Zondervan called Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. He is a consultant and a writer living in Indianapolis. He is senior fellow at the American Reformer, a former senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Public Research. He's been in the business world, has a business degree, and joins us now by phone. So, Aaron, welcome to Point of View.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, again, that particular article is one that got quite a bit of play, and I believe in large part is one of the reasons why you decided to expand it into this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to be able to expand the argument that I made in there, and then also talk more about what should we do. The original article talked about how society has changed in the way that it views Christianity and how that's affecting the evangelical church, but I didn't really get a chance to go into how do we respond to it, so I was able to do a lot more of that in the book.
Might just mention, too, it's endorsed by all sorts of people, including Rod Dreyer, who's, of course, been on the program with us many times to talk about everything from the Benedict option to a book I recommend all the time, Live Not by Lies. But let's go into the introduction, because one of the other individuals that you talk about there that we've had on this program are the Bentham brothers. Of course, we've had their father, but Jason and David Bentham were really on the top of the world. They had an HD TV show called Flip It Forward, and then the activists said, wait a minute, they said some things that seem anti-gay, and so this whole world came crashing down upon them. Now, again, to be fair, they were probably already involved in the culture war, but then to help us understand that it isn't just a one-off, you then tell the story of a church called the Crossing Church in Columbia, Missouri, and I know our listeners up in Missouri might be familiar with that. They really worked very hard to be really engaging the culture and not be as controversial. But again, it only took one sermon for an individual to say gender is not a social construct, and all of a sudden the world came crashing down on them. And the point you're making is not just that we have a cancel culture. I think we've covered that before, but the world has changed dramatically. Neither of those two individuals, say in the 60s and 70s, maybe even in the 80s, would have fared any kind of pushback. But I think it illustrates why you say we live in a negative world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody understands that there's been a sea change in American culture, probably going back to President Obama's second term. Certainly radical changes in America on sexuality, the so-called Great Awakening, and many other things as well, perhaps we could talk about. But this entry into what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of our country, sort of elite official culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically, is really an uncomfortable place. This sort of caught evangelicalism wrong-footed, and we're still trying to figure out how to respond to it.
Let's, if I can, have you for just a few minutes talk about those three worlds. And for those of you that like to take notes, you can number 1 to 3. The first one is the positive world, 1964 to 1994. The second is the neutral world from 1994 to 2014. And the third is the negative world, 2014 to the present. Can you kind of set that out? Because it is helpful to understand where we've come from in order to understand where we've now arrived.
Sure. America never had a state church like in Europe, but a sort of generic Protestant Christianity was, for most of our history, the default national religion. So if you go back to, say, the 1950s even, about half of all adults attended church each Sunday. That was the high watermark of church attendance. We had prayer in schools, Bible reading in schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money. We were adding "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. A lot of things like that. Then in the 1960s, this system started to unravel as Christianity went into decline in America. Decline in attendance, decline in adherence, and the moral system of Christianity began to get called into question. And I divide this period of decline from, say, 1964 to the present day into three eras or worlds. Again, the positive, neutral, and negative world. The positive world, 64 to 94. I want to be clear. This is a period of decline for Christianity. Things are not going well. Church attendance is down. The sexual revolution is happening, etc. And yet, Christianity is still basically viewed positively in America. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, and Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society, and you get in trouble if you don't follow them. Again, 1994, we hit a tipping point. We enter what I call the neutral world, where Christianity's not seen positively any longer, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. Christianity's moral norms have a sort of residual effect. And again, this era lasted from about 1994 to 2014. Then in 2014, we hit the second tipping point and entered again what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the history of the country, our official elite culture is negative towards Christianity. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job at Goldman Sachs or Google. Quite the opposite. Christian moral norms are expressly repudiated in society. And in many ways, evangelicals and devout Christians are now seen as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And again, this is a unprecedented and a very uncomfortable place to be.
We'll talk about some of the reasons for that, because there are some social forces that created that. And this is all part of this new book, Life in a Negative World. It is published by Zondervan. And Aaron, before we talk about how we ended up in a negative world, I guess it probably is fair to say that this timeline varies geographically. For example, my listeners in California, I grew up in California myself, the San Francisco Bay Area, I saw the negative world much earlier than, say, the particular timeline that you give us there. Yet my listeners, for example, in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, probably would follow that. Up there in Indiana, I mean, my father graduated from Purdue. I have an uncle who graduated from Indiana University. Probably it fits pretty well. So obviously, there's a little difference geographically, but it doesn't matter whether it started in California, started in New York, or it made its way to the middle of America. We are now in that negative world, aren't we?
Yes. There's an old saying, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. Definitely social trends begin in places like New York City, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and they radiate out to the rest of the country. And there are plenty of places where it's still basically positive towards people identifying as a Christian. So I live in suburban Indianapolis, the town where I live. Lots of people are Christians here. It's not something that people attack. Well, I think what is the case is that the key institutions of society essentially everywhere now implement these sort of new ideologies in a sense. You might think, I'm in a rural area of a red state. The things that are going on in the schools are not going on in my school. I guarantee you they're going on in your school.
Yes.
100%. The gender stuff is right there. And so that's an example of how essentially institutionally this sort of new public moral order now extends nationwide because, again, the core institutions of society embody it. Although, of course, it is quite different environment for different people. If you live in Manhattan, where I used to live in Manhattan, you're in a quite different place than you would be if you were in my hometown in rural southern Indiana.
Sure. And I remember seeing an interview where at one time you said, I love cities, and only a person that grew up in a town with a few hundred could actually love cities. So obviously you have had that kind of background as well. But just before we, of course, are going to spend a lot of time talking about life in the negative world, can you answer the question? Because you've got some great material from Charles Taylor. We've had people like Oz Guinness, oftentimes even as individuals looked at trends. I've talked about some of the reasons why we are in a negative world, because Aaron, you've got to understand that when I go out and speak to various groups, oftentimes associated with the radio stations that carry this, the biggest question I get sometimes is, how did we get here? I just do not recognize this country. What are the forces that brought about this negative world that we find ourselves in right now?
It's really hard to say what caused something. You mentioned Charles Taylor, a famous Canadian philosopher, wrote a book that got a lot of airplay called A Secular Age. It's 900 pages long, very dense, and he tells essentially a 500-year story arc of like how we got to now in terms of secularization. Some people like to criticize the Enlightenment. Some people say William of Ockham and nominalism back in the Middle Ages is where it all went wrong. I don't know, but I do highlight a few, call them landmarks along the way of what happened. One is, if you go back to the 1950s, America was still run by essentially this group of people, the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So we had this sort of national elite that, and it basically was what the name implies. Now, many of them were liberal Protestants, or maybe weren't that religious in terms of their religion, but Protestantism was definitely part of their identity. And of course, back in this era, infamously, Jews would get blackballed from country clubs, things of that nature. It was sort of controversial when John F. Kennedy, who was Catholic, ran for president in 1960. And so as long as this group of people, that was this class of people sort of extending back to the founding of the country, still dominated its political, economic, and institutional life, it's highly unlikely they ever would have allowed a sort of anti-Protestant, anti-Christian attitude to take root. But this establishment essentially collapsed in the 1960s. And so that created a vacuum that could then be filled by this sort of de-Christianization. A second one that's huge was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I really debated whether I should call the start of the neutral world 1994 or 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell.
Right.
Because, communism was atheist. And Christianity was part of the West. It was part of our moral battle against communism, which is why we were putting in God We Trust on our money in the 1950s, the Cold War. And so as long as the Cold War was ongoing, there was really no way we could have abandoned Christianity. But with the collapse of communism, this allowed sort of the elites, if you will, to unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be a Western liberal democracy. So those are really big. I also think the consolidation of corporate power, the rise of digital technologies certainly play a role in making our society much more top-down. You really only have two companies that make software for mobile phones, which is where all the internet happens today, is on mobile phones. And so essentially those two companies de facto control everything, Apple and Google. And so you get these firms that are now in a position to wield immense power over the cultural life of America in a way that would not have been possible even 25 years ago, certainly not 50 years ago.
And again, you talk about the sexual revolution, social revolution, a number of other things. And again, I would encourage people to read the book because let's, if we can, keep moving, because you then talk about the fact that we used to have certain strategies, even ways in which we did evangelism and apologetics, the way we articulated our views in the public policy arena. And those worked pretty well in a positive world, worked okay in a negative world, and they've really sort of backfired in the negative world. Can you help us with that?
Yeah. Well, evangelicalism is kind of a product of this period of Christian decline. Back in that mid-century era, it was really the mainline denominations that dominated the religious life of the country. And then the main lines really went into decline, and they were never able to figure out how to turn that ship around. And they're still shrinking today. Whereas evangelicalism was much more adaptable to changing times. That's been one of its hallmarks. And I think that's one of the reasons for optimism about today, by the way, is I think we will be able to successfully adapt again. But there were really three main strategies I identified that evangelicals implemented, two in the positive world and one in the neutral world, to help respond to changing times. So this was the culture war and seeker sensitivity in the positive world, and cultural engagement in the neutral world.
Right.
So again, culture war, it's the religious right. We all know people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, they saw things weren't going well. They saw the sexual revolution, et cetera. And their answer was, we're going to mobilize politically to fight back and take back the country. The very name of the leading organization of the culture war initially, Moral Majority, tells you were in a positive world. Nobody would create an organization called that today. And of course, the religious right is still with us. Seeker sensitivity was pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, Rick Warren at Saddleback Church in Orange County. These people saw that church was in decline, and so they said, why don't we create a church people would actually attend? And, the legend of Willow Creek is that Bill Hybels went door to door asking people why they didn't go to church. And as he said, he got an earful. And so he designed a church that would be consumer friendly. It's going to be informal. It's going to have contemporary music. We're going to get rid of stodgy hymns and choir robes, denominational distinctives. We're going to have topical therapeutic sermons. And it was a big success. And again, this is sort of the forerunner of today's non-denominational suburban megachurch, which is really in many respects the evangelical mainstream. And then in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of a third strategy called cultural engagement, pioneered by people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. You can think of cultural engagement either as a seeker sensitivity for the cities, much as, the seeker sensitivity is basically a suburban phenomenon. When the cities started coming back in the 90s, this was really a way of reaching the cities. And then also, to some extent, the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, they're like, why don't we talk to people? Take advantage of this pluralistic public square to have a conversation and try to articulate the gospel to people in a compelling way.
Yes.
And again, this is with us as well, sort of urban and college town Christianity, if you will. And these were all successful. They're all still successful in some ways. But as we've entered the negative world, we have not really developed any particular strategies for it. You mentioned Rod Dreher. His Benedict option is really the only thing that's been put out there for this to date. And evangelicals really rejected the Benedict option.
Yes. Well, although we've had him on the program, and of course, James Davidson Hunter and a couple of others like that. And I want to come back and kind of summarize some of this, but I didn't want to cut you off in mid-sentence. So let me jump in there, because when we come back, some very helpful chapters talking about how to live personally, how to live institutionally, and then engaging missionally. And in some respects, Aaron, we're going to talk about the so what question and really try to answer that, because in light of the fact that we do live in a negative world, you talk about, for example, living personally. And one of the things I appreciate is a famous quote, at least for those of us that do investing. Warren Buffett years ago said, you only find out who is swimming naked when the tide goes out. And that's a way of saying, during a bull market, everybody can make money. Remember that in the late 1990s and the dot-com boom, and even more recently, the stock market's been going up. But then you find out very quickly that some people don't have quite the same expertise when it becomes a bear market rather than a bull market. And you use that, given your business background, to say, when the storms come, when controversy hits, what do we do? And the test of a man or a woman of God is oftentimes in the fact that they were able to weather that storm. So what do you recommend in terms of, first, obedience? Then we'll get into issues of becoming excellent as well as becoming resilient, although I think the issue of obedience and resilience come together. But what would you recommend in light of the fact that we're not necessarily saying that the future is going to be utopia? It's going to be fairly difficult, and how should we react?
Exactly. I slice this across three dimensions. How should we live as sort of individuals and families? How should our churches and ministries and institutions think about the world? And then how do we do mission? And the first thing I talk about is, I'm a strategy guy, I'm a business consultant, but at the end of the day, this isn't a business strategy. This is about our relationship with God. And so there's not a lot of theology in the book, but one area I said there's theology is, we read all these passages in the New Testament talking about counting the cost, talking about counting all things as loss for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. And I think historically we just kind of glossed over them because it didn't really seem to apply to us, in America, where there might actually be some social benefits even to being known as a Christian. Well, today, the idea that we might have to pay a cost, even if it's just a social cost, is real. So we have to say, have we counted the cost? And I keep coming back to, Jesus really gave us his instructions for how to survive tough times. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he gives the example of people who built their houses on the rock versus the sand. And the person who built his house on the rock is the one who heard Jesus' words and actually did them, who put them into practice. And so, we need to be a lot more serious about becoming obedient to what he's called us to do. Because again, it's sort of been sunny weather in America for a long time. And so it didn't really seem to matter as much what your foundation was built on. We don't know if there's going to be a flood, how bad the storm might be, but we can certainly see the storm clouds coming. And a lot of us are going to find out what our foundation is made of. And so we have to make sure our foundation is in Christ and following his commands. That's the most important thing.
The other part of it that you talk about is becoming excellent. You quote from, of course, Mark Knowles' classic book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. But whether you look at that or even the fact that we really have not, even since you had the developing of a Christian mind being discussed, even in the 1960s. Let's give credit where credit is due. I hope that Point of View fits into that category. The Colson Center fits into that category. Many of the philosophers, apologists, and others that have been on this program are speaking do. But there is a real need for us, as you say, to create a culture of excellence. Can you talk about how we would do that?
Yeah, I mean, the world is just harder today. There's an economist named Tyler Cowen who wrote the book called Average is Over. It's a lot harder to get married, stay married, and build a family today than it was for my grandparents' generation. That's just in the secular world. And for those who are Christian, it's going to be even harder. So we need to really elevate our game in terms of all aspects of life. And part of it is because America was sort of a Christian country, even the old liberal Protestants held the same basic moral system as evangelicals. And so we could sort of rely to some extent on, those kinds of intellectuals and scientists and scholars to be our guide as well. Well, today, that's not true. I mean, you go to college, everything is ideology. You're going to get somebody who tells you, oh, yeah, there really is no such biological thing as sex, for example. There's no biological, difference between men and women. It's all socially constructed. That's crazy. And so it's like, oh, well, actually there are some differences between men and women. Obviously, there's a social dimension to our life together. And, that's an example as well. I sort of want to get to the race issue. I think the race issue is another one where secular society has a set of dogmas. And I think we in the church have to have a better answer to the legitimate challenges and injustices around race, one that we just don't farm it out to atheists to do our thinking on that topic. We have to have better answers on some of these things. And that means we have to have our own intellectuals, our own lay leaders who really have top-level expertise. It's kind of a shame, right, that the guy who got famous for reaching so many young men out there in the world was Jordan Peterson. And why can't we have a Christian psychologist who's just as insightful as Jordan Peterson was? And I think we need to be so much more engaged on these points. But of course, it applies both to kind of intellectuals and other sorts of leaders, but also to all of us. I mean, again, staying married today, building a successful marriage in 21st century America is hard. We absolutely can't just be mailing it in. And like, again, my grandparents, they could just sort of assume they were going to stay married for the rest of their life. You can't assume that today. You have to be actively working on your marriage. You can't just, assume it. And so I think life's degree of difficulty dial has been turned up.
Yep. Another way I put it is that many of the forces for your grandparents and maybe even your parents would be more gravitational. There were a lot of things pulling you back together. You wouldn't say some of the things that people say out loud on social media around the family table, say, half a century ago. But now most of the forces on the family are centrifugal, pulling you apart. But let's move on to, and again, there's so many good chapters, at least talking about leading institutionally, because we have a lot of people that are listening that are pastors or Sunday school teachers or life group leaders or even seminary students. And the first chapter is about pursuing institutional integrity. I had a commentary came out last week. It was just entitled Trust. And the argument is that, can we trust the media? Not really. Can we trust health officials? No. Do we want to trust the World Economic Forum? Certainly not. Well, do we trust churches? Those churches that sometimes have individuals teaching false doctrine, or churches that fail in some cases to report sexual abuse. So it seems to me that while we're actually calling for Christians to get their act together, it seems to me that you're really calling for churches to have institutional integrity.
Well, that's right. I mean, just because the world might criticize you for unfair reasons doesn't mean we don't have our own internal problems. Judgment begins with the household of God. So we need to be people who are operating our institutions and our churches with the highest degree of integrity in terms of just basic trustworthiness, competence, handling our finances well, strong theologies, doing all those things correctly. And as you know, with like abuse scandals, financial scandals, various, weird theologies that people promote. We have a lot of work to do there as well. But there's also what I call missional integrity. I actually somewhat use the term integrity here in terms of the structural integrity of, say, a ship or an airplane under pressure. Mm-hmm. As the negative world bears down on us, we have to avoid deforming under the pressure and be able to stay on mission. And it's kind of a highly adaptable movement. Evangelicalism is always in danger of getting blown here and there by the winds and the cultural currents. So we want to adapt to changing times. At the same time, we want to understand what is our mission and not let the pressures of this world move us off of that.
Aaron, just before I run out of time, let's talk about engaging missionally. And it seems to me that you talk about be a light. And the first thing that you mention is if you're going to be a light, sometimes you have to define some terms, because you point out that when Billy Graham started holding crusades back in the 1940s and even in the 1950s, he could assume a fair amount of understanding about the Christian faith and things of that nature. But now we live in a much more difficult world. And one of the things you mentions is the advertising campaign, He Gets Us. Well, of course, we saw some of those in the Super Bowl during the commercials. But the bottom line is you have to back up a little bit. You have to do what Francis Schaeffer and others called pre-evangelism. And so we certainly should be light in a dark culture, but we're going to have to overcome even some times in which there's a bias against us, or sometimes just a suspiciousness or understanding, a misunderstanding of what Christianity really entails.
Right. This is part of the challenge of the loss of the so-called cultural Christianity. A lot of people were not fans of cultural Christianity. They say, we're glad it's gone. It produced hypocrites. It produced unsaved people, etc. But undoubtedly, there was some of that. But it also gave people a grounding in Christianity so that they basically knew the Bible stories, right? They knew who Jesus was. They knew a lot of the basics of the faith. Maybe they were raised in church because their parents wanted them to get a good moral instruction or something like that. So maybe they didn't come to faith, but they at least knew the basics. So you could sort of preach the gospel to them, and it sort of activated all this latent information that they had. Well, today, a lot of people literally don't know anything about Christianity. They probably heard of Jesus, but they don't really know anything about him. So we kind of have to explain a little bit of what's going on here. We can't just presume familiarity with the Bible like people could in the past.
And it's amazing because we do have to obviously define our terms. But I want to pick out another chapter there as well about truth, because you quote from Rod Dreher. Of course, he's endorsed your book, and he's been on the program with us many times. And Kelly Shackelford will be with us on our Friday weekend edition. I think we've all collectively probably increased the number of people that have purchased the book, Live Not by Lies. But as you point out, that comes from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's essay. And the idea is there's really a lot of pressure these days, Aaron, on really forcing us to go along with lies. Men can have babies. There's more than two genders. There is no right for anybody to tell anybody else what to do. Tolerance means a complete exception of any kind of lifestyle, value, and the rest. And so it does seem to me that more than ever, as we seek to bring light to the culture, we're also going to need to have courage, and we're really going to have to clarify truth. Obviously, we need to speak truth in love, but there is going to be a greater need than ever before in this negative world, don't you think?
Yes, and I think people are interested in truth. And again, I got interested in writing about Christian issues because I saw so many young men turning to these secular online influencers, but not to the church. And I'm like, why are they turning to these people? And they're, nobody had heard of these guys back then. Well, now everybody knows, Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Jocko Willink, or the infamous Andrew Tate. Some of why they were attracted to it was, because they were interested in sinful things. But some of it is because some of these guys were willing to say true things that they weren't hearing from traditional authorities. So again, Jordan Peterson would tell people things like, hey, men and women are different. Here's how they differ in psychological profiles. Here's the implications of that. Sometimes, for example, we'll hear things like I hear people in church say things like godliness is sexy. Well, you might only marry a godly man, but why is he sexy in the first place? And as Jordan Peterson pointed out, girls are attracted to boys who win status contests with those boys. Like, we all knew that in high school. And so it's like people aren't like giving you like the truth. And so I feel like we have to be willing to just be very clear on some of these points, because people are hungry. That's why they're turning to these influencers. They're hungry for some kind of truth. They know that the world is telling them lies, and we need to figure out how to give them the actual truth, right? Not a bunch of therapeutic claptrap, right, or self-help stuff that they might get from the world. I think we have a better truth, and we need to get in the game in articulating it clearly and in a compelling way.
Let me just mention that we do have a link to your website, aaronrenn.com. The book has 12 chapters, and Aaron, of course, anybody can read this individually, but I do know that we have small group leaders and life group leaders that sometimes are looking for something that would be good to lead a group through. And the way you have it broken down in these 12 chapters, it could be actually 12 weeks. And I suspect that if they were looking for other information in addition to the book, they can go to your website, because you have a newsletter, you have a podcast, you have all sorts of archives and other resources. So very quickly, just before I let you go, talk about how people can use this book either individually or collectively.
Sure. If you read it, I think you'll find at least one good idea in it that you can put into practice. It does lend itself to discussions. Like, each chapter is essentially a separate topic. So you could do a small group out of it. I'm actually doing a monthly reading list with many of my newsletter readers, and we're doing like a monthly Zoom session and discussing the book chapter by chapter. We've had great discussions so far, and so I think it's definitely should be a lot to argue about as well, discuss as well. So I think that could be good. The idea here is to create something that's useful and get you thinking and understanding what is going on in this world, how do we make sense in it, and then how do we orient ourselves to that and start thinking about how we adapt. It's not a recipe or a formula, but it's more like insight to help you start making the decisions, because everybody's in a different situation here in America. But giving you those starter ideas to help you start engaging, again, across the dimensions.
I might also mention that people can talk to you about maybe speaking to men's issues, because if you look at your latest issues on the newsletter, you have teachings of neo-pagan masculinity, Handyman's Guide to Masculinity, as well as Smashing the Status Hierarchy, just a number of things that people will find. So, Aaron, if people would like to have you come and speak, is that a possibility as well?
Absolutely. Just people should just go to my website, aaronrenn.com, sign up. I'm easy to find. You can read my stuff and, contact me there.
And again, there's a place where you can subscribe. There's a place where you can contact him, so that if you'd like to know more information, that is the case. We've appreciated the work that you put together, first of all, writing First Things, and then especially in this book, 250 pages, published by our friends at Zondervan, and is written by Aaron Renn. And Aaron, it's been great to have you on the program today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Well, hope you appreciated the conversation we had here today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.